close your eyes gently and allow the noise of the day to soften. Tonight, we walk slowly into the past, not with urgency, but with quiet steps, into candlelit halls, long corridors, and voices that have long since faded. This is the story of a life lived under watchful eyes, a life shaped by silence, patience, and careful thought, a life that moved from uncertainty into power, and from power into memory. There is no need to hurry here. Let the mind drift as the story unfolds. Let each moment arrive slowly, like footsteps echoing in a distant palace. And as we begin, imagine the soft glow of candlelight against stone walls and the quiet breathing of history itself. In the early autumn of 1533, when the fields of England were turning pale gold, and the evenings came a little sooner each day, a child was born at Greenwich Palace beside the slow grey water of the Thames. She entered the world on the 7th day of September, wrapped at once in silk, ceremony, and expectation. Her father was Henry VIII, King of England, large in presence and certain in will. Her mother was Anne Boleyn, dark-eyed, quick-minded, and already surrounded by admiration, envy, and fear. The palace had been prepared for triumph. Rooms had been hung with rich cloth. Messengers had waited in hallways. Great officers of the household had moved through polished chambers with careful, important faces. The court expected news that would settle the kingdom's long unease. Henry had broken with old loyalties, overturned old customs, and risked the peace of his realm in the hope of one thing above all others. He wanted a son. For years that wish had shaped the kingdom. It lay behind prayers whispered in chapels and behind arguments spoken loudly in council rooms. It passed through royal marriages, legal disputes, and sermons from pulpits. It even changed the pattern of Europe, drawing England away from the familiar authority of Rome. The desire for a male heir was not only the desire of a father, it was presented as the need of the state, the promise of stability, the answer to civil fear. Men still remembered the old wars between rival houses, the bloodshed that had come when succession was uncertain. A son, it was said, would quiet all dangers. But the child born that September morning was not a son. She was a daughter. The disappointment, though it had to be dressed in graceful words, moved through the palace like a draught under a closed door. Bells rang, yes, and official announcements were made. The infant princess was baptized with splendid care. The great and the noble bowed to custom. Yet beneath the order of the ceremony lay a different feeling, harder to hide in private rooms. A daughter could be cherished. A daughter could be praised. But a daughter was not what had been hoped for. The little girl received the name Elizabeth, perhaps after her grandmother Elizabeth of York, perhaps with thoughts of family harmony and dynastic blessing. Her cradle was fine. Her nursery was furnished with all that royal love and royal display could provide. She had gentlewomen to watch her, servants to carry her, chaplains to pray over her, and officers to account for every item that touched her small life. From the beginning, she lived in comfort and under guard. Richness and danger stood close together around her. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, did not at once surrender hope. She was still young. She still believed she could give the king the son he wanted. Around her gathered those who had risen with her and those who watched for her first mistake. She had climbed very high, very fast. She had become queen where once she had stood as a lady in waiting. Such a rise could never be quiet. It created devotion, resentment, ambition, and suspicion in equal measure. The court, in those months, had a strange stillness beneath its glitter. Fires burned in vast stone hearths. Candles trembled against carved walls. Musicians played. Dishes of silver and gold were set before the king. Yet all this brightness seemed to rest on something tense and uncertain. Men measured their words. Women listened before speaking. Every glance might carry meaning. Every silence might conceal judgment. In the Tudor court, favour could feel like sunlight in winter, and its loss could come just as quickly. As the baby Elizabeth grew from a swaddled infant into a watchful child, she moved through a world of polished wood, embroidered hangings, narrow stairways, and long corridors that held the chill of stone even in daylight. The royal houses of England were not only places of comfort, they were also places of ceremony and surveillance. Doors opened quietly. Footsteps echoed and faded. Servants passed with lowered eyes. Behind one tapestry there might be warmth and laughter. Behind another, a conversation might unfold that would shape a life. When Elizabeth was only a few months old, she was given a household of her own, as royal children often were. This was a sign of rank and dignity. It also meant distance. Noble children, even beloved ones, were not always raised in the constant company of their parents. They were tended by nurses, governesses, and carefully chosen attendants. Their meals, clothing, and hours of sleep were recorded. Their manners were formed early. Their bodies were watched for signs of health or weakness. Their future was considered before they had learned to speak. So the infant princess lived among women who lifted her, fed her, and soothed her. She would have known the warmth of wool blankets, the sweetness of milk, the glow of candlelight through linen curtains. She would have heard prayers in Latin, gossip in murmured English, and the changing tones of adults who thought a child too young to understand. But children understand more than they can say. Even before words, they notice tension. They know when a room tightens. They feel when hands become nervous. The king still visited, and when he came, there was movement and energy around him. Henry VIII had charm as well as power. He could be generous, learned, musical, and warm. He could also be changeable, demanding, and terrible in anger. To some, he remained magnificent. To others, he was a storm that had not yet broken. For Elizabeth, in those earliest years, he was simply father and king at once, a figure too large to be separated into ordinary parts. Anne, for her part, loved her daughter. The surviving traces of that affection are faint but real. She ordered fine things for the child, worried over her well-being, and kept hope for the future close to her heart. Yet love could not protect either mother or daughter from the logic of the court. Anne's value in the eyes of many still rested on one expectation. She must give England a prince. Pregnancies came and failed. Promises weakened. Time, which first had seemed generous, began to narrow around her. The king's patience shifted. Court factions sharpened their efforts. Those who had once bowed deeply before Anne began to study her with colder eyes. Some had never forgiven her rise. Some feared her influence. Some simply moved, as courtiers often do, toward the side where advantage seemed likely to remain. The weather of court life can change without warning. 1 week there is music, flattering letters, gifts, and smiles. The next, conversations stop when a certain person enters. Doors are slower to open. A jest goes unanswered. A servant fails to meet the eye. Something invisible has altered, and everyone feels it at once. In the spring of 1536, when Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, the darkness gathered quickly. Anne Boleyn's fall did not come as a gradual fading into private sorrow. It came with the sharp machinery of accusation. Men around her were arrested. Charges were shaped and repeated. Rumors spread through halls, kitchens, chapels, and streets. Some people believed them. Some did not. Many understood that belief was less important than power. For a child, such events are impossible to comprehend. There is only the change in atmosphere, the sudden removal of familiar faces, the uncertainty in the adults who dress and feed you. A nurse who once hummed softly now listens at the door. A gentle woman presses her lips together before answering a question. The child does not know the law, the politics, the dangerous uses of testimony. The child only feels that safety has thinned. Anne was taken to the Tower of London, that ancient fortress by the river, where stone walls had held kings, traitors, saints, and the condemned. There, in rooms both royal and prison-like, she waited. Her words in those final days were remembered in fragments by those who heard them. Sometimes she seemed composed. Sometimes her mind moved quickly from prayer to irony to fear. She had lived at the center of attention for years. Now she lived under watch, under judgment, and under the terrible nearness of death. The little Elizabeth was elsewhere, yet absence did not mean protection. News travelled fast in Tudor England, and faster still inside the court. Servants carried it in lowered voices. Officials carried it in sealed documents. Nobles carried it in glances. The king himself moved on with alarming speed. Before Anne was dead, plans for another marriage had already taken shape in the minds of men who understood how quickly a royal household could rearrange itself. On the 19th day of May, Anne Boleyn was executed on Tower Green. The morning was clear. The ceremony was controlled, almost careful in its formality, as if order might soften violence. But death remained death. The queen, who had once dazzled a court and altered a kingdom, knelt and was beheaded. She was not yet 36. Her body was placed in a simple chest and buried within the Tower precincts. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. There is something especially sorrowful in the lives of children who are too young to remember clearly and yet old enough to be marked forever. Elizabeth may not have held a lasting image of her mother's face in that final season. She may not have understood what loss had occurred, but the loss entered her life all the same. It altered her status, her security, and the emotional air in which she would grow. Soon after Anne's death, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. The daughter of a queen became, in law, a child set aside from the direct line as it had once been imagined for her. Titles changed. Household forms changed. What had been hers by certainty became hers only by the king's shifting will. This was no small administrative matter. In Tudor England, legitimacy shaped dignity, inheritance, marriage prospects, and political value. To strip a child of it was to recast her future in cold official language. Imagine the corridors then, the long passages of Hatfield or Eltham or Greenwich, depending on where the household had gone, cool underfoot and dim in the late afternoon, tapers burning low, linen rustling, somewhere a clock marking the hour with solemn indifference. And moving through these spaces, a little princess no longer quite a princess in the old sense, carried by attendants whose faces revealed too much or too little. She belonged to the royal blood, and yet she had become a reminder of failure, danger, and an erased marriage. The adults around her had to adjust themselves carefully. They could not speak openly before her, but neither could they entirely hide the truth. Some pitied her, some feared being too kind, some thought only of their own position and how best to preserve it. In such a world, a child learns early that affection may be genuine, but it is rarely simple. Henry married Jane Seymour not long after Anne's execution. The speed of it must have sent another wave of shock through the court, though few would have dared show it. The king's life moved forward by command, and others were expected to follow. Jane was mild where Anne had been sharp, quiet where Anne had been dazzling. To many, she appeared a safer queen. More importantly, she offered new hope for the son still desired above all else. Elizabeth remained in the shadows of this new arrangement. She was cared for, fed, clothed, and educated as suited her birth. But her place was precarious. She had no mother to defend her memory. Her father's love, if real, was separated by distance, mood, and politics. She lived near greatness, without the assurance of belonging securely within it. There is a particular loneliness in being a royal child. One is never alone in the ordinary sense. There are always people nearby, hands adjusting sleeves, voices asking after lessons, footsteps outside the chamber. Yet true privacy is absent, and true trust may be scarce. The child becomes an object of attention, expectation, and management. Feelings must fit the order of the household. Grief is not allowed to spread wildly. Fear is soothed if possible, but never permitted to interfere with routine for long. Bells ring, accounts are kept, meals are served. Life goes on because the machinery of the court must go on. Elizabeth's early years unfolded under this discipline. She learned where warmth could be found, in a nurse's calm voice, in the familiarity of a prayer repeated each evening, in the comfort of books and letters as she grew older, in the stable rhythm of study. But before those later consolations, there was the simple experience of uncertainty. The walls around her were handsome but hard. Tapestries softened draughts but could not remove them. In winter, cold slid under doors and settled into the stones. Candles created islands of gold against the dark. A child waking in the night might see shadows moving on carved beams, hear distant doors closing, hear perhaps a servant crossing the corridor with careful speed. Tudor palaces were full of life, but not always of peace. And then there were the whispers. Whispers were the true language of danger at court. They passed where official speech could not. They linked kitchens to chapels, nurseries to privy chambers. They carried news of marriages, pregnancies, alliances, falls from favour, and private grief. For a child, whispers are especially powerful. They suggest that something is wrong, but leave its shape undefined. One hears one's own name spoken softly. One notices that the speaker turns away. One feels excluded from the story of one's own life. Perhaps Elizabeth heard words like mother, queen, king's pleasure, and bastard long before she understood them. Perhaps she saw a face suddenly stiffen after speaking too freely. Perhaps she learned to become still, to watch without appearing to watch. The habit of observation often begins in such childhoods. When speech is dangerous, silence becomes a kind of shelter. When certainty is rare, one studies expression, mood, and timing. Elizabeth, later famous for caution and intelligence, may have first practiced both as a very small girl in rooms where nothing stable could be assumed. Yet childhood also has its stubborn gentleness. Even in troubled years, there would have been mornings of sunlight on rushes, bright ribbons laid out for dressing, little shoes warmed near the fire, the smell of bread, fruit, or herbs in a warm chamber. There would have been toys, pets perhaps, songs sung softly, and women who truly cared for her comfort. History often records the harsh outline of events, but not the ordinary mercies that helped a child endure them. Still, the outline mattered. The king's court was a place where one queen had been put aside, another beheaded, and a third elevated in hope of the son who might secure everything. Elizabeth's existence was tied to these changes. Her life began not in settled joy, but in a contest of hopes. Her earliest memories, if not exact in image, were formed in an environment where love, fear, ambition, and obedience all wore court dress. When Jane Seymour finally gave birth to a son in 1537, the rejoicing in England was immense. At last, Henry had the prince he had sought for so long. The child, Edward, was celebrated as the answer to prayers and the future of the Tudor line. But Jane died soon after childbirth, and another mother vanished from the royal story. The court knew how to celebrate and how to mourn, Yet it also knew how quickly mourning could be arranged into ritual and then set aside. For Elizabeth, this new prince changed the emotional landscape once again. He was her half-brother, and his birth pushed her further from the center of expectation. She was still of royal blood. She was still important, but she was no longer even the best possible hope of succession. A son now lived. The kingdom turned toward him as flowers turn toward light. This could have erased her. In another family or another kingdom, perhaps it might have done so. But Henry's children remained significant because Tudor politics rarely allowed any bloodline to become entirely unimportant. A daughter could become a marriage alliance. A daughter could become a rallying point. A daughter could become a danger to one faction and a necessity to another. So Elizabeth remained watched. Her education, when it began in earnest, would become one of the gifts that danger indirectly gave her. Those responsible for her understood that rank required refinement. She learned language, scripture, manners, and the habits of concentration. But before the celebrated scholar princess emerged, there was simply the young child learning how to move carefully in an unstable household. Adults must have spoken around her of obedience, humility, and gratitude. These were common lessons for children, especially girls. Yet in her case, they carried an edge. She was expected to know her place, and her place had already shifted once through no fault of her own. That kind of lesson leaves a mark. It teaches not only self-control, but also the fragility of identity when others have the power to rename you. One can imagine her in a window seat, small hands resting on the sill, looking out toward a courtyard silvered by mist. Horses pass below. A servant crosses with folded cloth. Somewhere a bell sounds from a chapel tower. The sky hangs low over the roofs. She's too young to understand governments, inheritance law, and ecclesiastical revolution. Yet she knows enough to feel absence. She knows that fathers are not always near. She knows that mothers can vanish. She knows that adults exchange looks over her head. That knowledge, though wordless, is heavy. The court itself remained full of ceremony. Feast days came and went. Ambassadors arrived in velvet and fur. Clergymen preached obedience to the order established by God and King. Noble families sought places close to favor. All the while, under the splendid surfaces, memory remained dangerous. Anne Boleyn could not be openly honored. To speak of her with too much tenderness might be taken as criticism of the king. To defend her fully was impossible. Silence settled over her name like dust over a tomb. For Elizabeth, that silence was another kind of inheritance. Many children grow up hearing stories of their mothers. They are told which features they share, which habits resemble her own, what she liked, how she laughed, what hope she held. Elizabeth did not receive such simple storytelling. Her mother's memory was entangled with scandal, official condemnation, and fear. To ask too directly might embarrass or alarm those around her. To answer too honestly might endanger them. So the mother became a shadow at the edge of life, both near and far. There were perhaps items once belonging to Anne, glimpsed and then removed. There may have been servants who had known her well and softened when they saw the child's face. There may have been moments when some likeness appeared unexpectedly in expression or colouring, and a room fell silent for a beat too long. These things matter. Children notice when their existence awakens feeling in others. The coldness of stone corridors has often stood in memory for the coldness of political life, and in Elizabeth's early years the image fits well. She grew not in a sheltered cottage, nor in a stable noble home, but in buildings where policy and personal fortune were woven tightly together. To walk those halls was to move through an architecture of power. Every chamber had rank attached to it. Every entrance could signify privilege or exclusion. Every table, garment, and seat at chapel reflected order. Even a child could sense who stood high and who had fallen, and fall was everywhere in the lessons the court offered. Anne had risen and fallen. Catherine of Aragon had been honoured and then cast aside. Great men who advised the king might flourish one season and disappear the next. If Elizabeth absorbed this pattern, it would have taught her something deep and quiet, that no position was secure, and that survival might depend on patience more than display. There is melancholy in such a childhood, but also a strange sharpening of the inner life. Children deprived of easy safety often turn inward. They build private rooms within the mind. They listen more than they speak. They come to value books, patterns, languages, prayers, and memory, because these do not abandon them in the same public way that people can. In Elizabeth's later life, observers would note her intelligence, discipline, and emotional reserve. The beginnings of these qualities may be traced back through the dim nursery rooms and guarded passages of her youth. Yet she was not made only by fear. She was also made by endurance. Each day that began in uncertainty still had to be lived. She dressed, ate, learned, rested, and rose again. The rhythm of ordinary life continued around political rupture. This, too, is a truth of history. Even in dangerous courts, children laugh sometimes. They chase small dogs across a chamber. They resist lessons. They hold onto a doll. They cry from tiredness. They ask impossible questions. Life does not become pure tragedy, even when tragedy stands near the door. And so, the child Elizabeth remained, a small figure moving through great houses, watched by servants, discussed by statesmen, claimed and unclaimed by fortune. Her father's realm stretched around her in all its uneasy grandeur. The church bells still sounded across towns. Ships still moved along the rivers. Harvests still came in. But in the private world of the palace, where the future of a kingdom could depend on the body of one woman and the mood of one man, she learned very early that love could be conditional, that names could be taken away, and that survival might begin in silence. The image that lingers is a quiet one, a narrow corridor at dusk, fading light through a high window, the stone floor cold beneath the rushes. Somewhere beyond the wall, voices lowered at once. A child pauses listening, though she cannot yet understand. She stands in a gown too fine for comfort, touched by a draught from an opening door. Around her is all the majesty of Tudor England, and within it The solitude of a little girl whose life has already been marked by birth, expectation, and loss. From that solitude, she would one day rise into history, but for now she is only Elizabeth, the daughter once hoped to be a prince, the child of Anne Boleyn, moving quietly through danger before she's old enough to name it. As the years passed, the child in the corridor grew into a girl with steady eyes and a quiet manner. The kingdom around her did not become simpler. It only changed its shape. New queens entered the royal household. Old griefs settled into silence. Rules shifted, titles shifted, affections shifted. But Elizabeth remained, watching, learning, and becoming more inward with each season. She was still Henry's daughter. That fact could never be erased. Even when law declared her illegitimate, her blood remained royal, and everyone around her knew it. Her position was uncertain, yet important. She belonged and did not belong at the same time. This taught her a difficult balance very early. She had to remember her dignity, but never display too much pride. She had to accept kindness, but not assume it would last. She had to exist near power without seeming to reach for it. Her father's court moved from marriage to marriage. Jane Seymour had given Henry the son he wanted, and then died before she could enjoy her triumph. After her came Anne of Cleves, whose marriage to the king faded almost as soon as it began. Then came Catherine Howard, very young and bright for a brief moment, before she too fell under accusation and died by execution. After so many queens, the royal household must have felt to Elizabeth like a stage where women were welcomed with ceremony and then judged by impossible standards. For a girl growing up under such examples, womanhood could not appear safe. A queen might wear jewels, ride in splendor, and sit at the center of attention. Yet her place depended on the king's favor, on her ability to satisfy expectation, and on the shifting talk of those who surrounded her. Beauty did not protect. Charm did not protect. Even obedience did not always protect. These lessons entered Elizabeth's mind long before she was old enough to speak of them plainly. And yet, there was also warmth in some of these changing households. Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, brought something calmer into the royal family. She was intelligent, educated, and serious in her faith. She had known loss already in her own life, and perhaps that gave her a gentler understanding of others. Under her influence, the king's children were drawn into a more ordered family circle than they had known before. Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward were not free of danger, but they were treated with a certain renewed dignity. Catherine Parr mattered especially for Elizabeth. She was the kind of woman a clever girl could admire. She valued learning. She took religion seriously. She wrote, read, and discussed ideas with confidence. She showed that a woman at court might possess both grace and intellect. For Elizabeth, whose mind was already quick and eager, this must have been deeply important. By then, Elizabeth was old enough to reveal the shape of her abilities. She learned eagerly and well. Her tutors found in her a seriousness that set her apart. She loved language. She studied Latin and Greek, and later French and Italian. Words became for her not only tools of learning, but tools of protection. To master language is to master tone, timing, and meaning. Elizabeth learned very early that how one speaks can matter as much as what one says. Her education was rigorous, as befitted a royal child of promise. Humanist scholars shaped her studies. She read classical texts, scripture, moral philosophy, rhetoric, and history. She was trained to think, to compare, to remember, and to express herself with care. Such learning could form the mind, but it could also steady the heart. Books gave pattern to a world that often seemed unstable. Grammar had rules. Translation required patience. History offered examples, warnings, and distant companionship. One can imagine her in a chamber in the soft morning light, a book open before her, the page held flat by slender fingers. The room is cool. Outside, the sky hangs white with mist. A servant has stirred the fire. Somewhere nearby, another household member is being dressed for the day. But Elizabeth's attention is fixed on the line before her. In the discipline of study, she finds a place where order still exists. Those around her notice not only her intelligence, but her self-command. Some children speak quickly and reveal whatever rises to the mind. Elizabeth learned not to do this. She listened first. She measured the room. She watched how one person answered another. She observed whether a remark was sincere, careless, or dangerous. These were not small courtly tricks. They were methods of survival. The royal household remained full of emotional cross-currents. Henry could still be imposing, affectionate, remote, and terrifying, sometimes all within the memory of a single day. Mary, Elizabeth's older half-sister, carried the long wounds of her own childhood, marked by the divorce of her mother and the breaking apart of the old order. Edward, the younger half-brother, was precious to the kingdom because he was male, and because he embodied the future others had fought so hard to create. Around them gathered servants, tutors, nobles, chaplains, ladies, and officials, each with private hopes and fears. In such a household, even family affection was touched by politics. A smile could be genuine and still be useful. A lesson in manners could also be a lesson in obedience. Praise might lift a child, but it might also make others watch more closely. Elizabeth learned to move through this world without showing too much of herself. She developed a stillness that could look like serenity from the outside, though it may have begun as caution. She also developed poise. This is not the same as ease. Ease belongs to those who feel secure. Poise belongs to those who have learned how to remain balanced while standing on uncertain ground. Elizabeth's poise was early, almost protective. She could be gracious without being open. She could be warm without surrendering control. She could answer well while revealing very little. Her tutors helped shape this quality. Among the most important was Roger Ascham, who later wrote admiringly of her learning. He saw in her not merely the accomplishments expected of a princess, but real intellectual force. She read with care. She translated with elegance. She worked seriously. Ascham praised not only her skill, but her discipline, which may say even more. Talent can dazzle. Discipline endures. The world of books and languages offered her a kind of inward kingdom. There she could dwell among Roman historians, Greek philosophers, Christian thinkers, and the measured beauty of ordered expression. In those pages, she encountered rulers who succeeded through prudence, women praised for constancy, and states undone by rashness. Such reading must have confirmed what life had already begun to teach her. Restraint could save, impulse could destroy. By the last years of Henry's reign, Elizabeth had become known for intelligence and grace. She was not at the centre of succession in the way Edward was. She was not burdened with the same religious significance that Mary carried in the eyes of many. Yet she mattered. She was visible enough to be noticed, and vulnerable enough to be in danger. That combination required care. Then, in January 1547, Henry VIII died. For England, the death of the king marked the end of an age of force, spectacle, and fear. For Elizabeth, it meant another great shift. She was 13 years old, a child, and no longer a child. Her half-brother Edward became king, though still a boy himself. Real power moved into the hands of men who governed in his name. The great figure who had shaped every room by his presence was gone, and in the quiet after such a death, many ambitions woke at once. Catherine Parr, now the Dowager Queen, soon married Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Jane Seymour and uncle to the young King Edward VI. This marriage happened quickly, more quickly than many thought proper. Thomas Seymour was handsome, ambitious, restless, and eager for influence. He had charm, and he liked display. He also had a dangerous confidence, the confidence of a man who believes he can move faster than caution allows. Elizabeth went to live for a time in the household of Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour. At first, this might have seemed natural enough. Catherine had shown care for her. The household was learned and refined. It offered companionship and continuity after the king's death. Yet within this apparently settled arrangement lay a disturbance that would leave a deep impression on the young princess. The episode is delicate, and it must be spoken of gently. Elizabeth was still very young, poised between girlhood and womanhood. Thomas Seymour began to behave toward her with a familiarity that was not fitting. At times he entered her chamber in the morning in a playful manner, before she was fully dressed. At times there was touching or teasing that should never have been permitted. Catherine Parr at first seems to have treated some of this conduct as harmless foolishness, or as a kind of rough play. But what may have been dismissed as lightness had already crossed into something else. For Elizabeth, the experience must have been deeply confusing. She had been trained to show respect. She had been trained to keep control of her face and words. She lived in a world where powerful older men were rarely contradicted directly by young girls. She also lived in a world where a woman's reputation could be damaged by rumour alone. To protest too openly might create scandal. To endure in silence was dangerous in another way. She was asked, in effect, to protect herself within a structure that did not fully protect her. This is where her caution deepened into something harder. One can picture those mornings with painful clarity, a chamber not yet fully warm, curtains half drawn, a young girl startled into wakefulness, laughter that does not feel kind, the presence of an older man who treats boundaries as a game. Outside the chamber, the household continues. Fires are lit, water is carried, lessons await. But within that moment, safety becomes uncertain in a new and intimate way. Eventually, Catherine Parr appears to have understood that the situation was serious. There were efforts to separate Elizabeth from Seymour's presence. In one account, Catherine herself joined in a troubling scene of cutting Elizabeth's gown, perhaps in the tone of jest, though it is difficult to read without sorrow. Soon after, Elizabeth was sent away from the household. The official explanation could preserve decorum. The deeper truth was that matters had become dangerous. Catherine Parr then died in childbirth in September 1548. Once again, a stepmother who had offered Elizabeth some measure of intellectual companionship and maternal steadiness was gone. And once again, a death created openings for ambition. Thomas Seymour's behaviour did not become wiser in grief. Instead, he continued in schemes to enlarge his influence, and at some point he seems to have entertained thoughts involving Elizabeth as a possible bride. Whether his motives were desire, ambition, vanity, or some mixture of all three, the effect on Elizabeth was ominous. Soon suspicion gathered around him. His actions toward the king's government became alarming. He was arrested in 1549. Then came the inquiries. This was the true test for Elizabeth. Investigators questioned her household. Servants were examined. Letters were sought. Every word, glance, and silence became material for suspicion. The young princess, not yet 16, found herself near a scandal that could ruin her. She knew from family history what accusation could do. She knew what happened to women whose names became attached to dangerous talk. Now she had to answer questions with precision, while men searched for signs of guilt, impropriety, or hidden intention. Her performance under this pressure was extraordinary. Elizabeth did not collapse into panic. She did not speak wildly. She did not offer more than was necessary. She understood, perhaps with a clarity beyond her years, that language could preserve or destroy her. She answered carefully. She insisted on the truth where she could. She withheld herself from careless elaboration. She showed intelligence, composure, and an instinct for self-defense that seems astonishing in one so young, though it had been forming in her all her life. The officials who dealt with her saw a girl already becoming formidable in restraint. She could not control what others had said. She could not erase Seymour's conduct. She could not prevent rumour. But she could govern her own speech. And she did. This does not mean she felt no fear. Quite the opposite. One senses fear everywhere beneath the smoothness of her replies. But it was a fear mastered and arranged, not allowed to flood outward. She had learned by then that emotion shown too freely could be used against her. Tears might be interpreted as guilt. Anger might be interpreted as defiance. Warmth might be interpreted as invitation. So she turned again to the safest instrument she possessed: self-command. There is a lonely greatness in this. A young girl, already marked by her mother's fate, already educated to watch and to measure, now standing amid inquiry and danger, aware that her future may depend on the placement of each sentence. She was not yet queen. She had no army, no office, no husband, no secure power. What she had was intelligence and restraint. Thomas Seymour was executed in March 1549. With his fall, the immediate danger passed, but the inward lesson remained. Elizabeth had seen, very closely, how easily a woman's honour could be entangled in the recklessness of a man. She had seen how desire, ambition, and rumor could blend into something almost impossible to control. She had also discovered that survival required not innocence alone, but discipline. After this, her reserve seems to deepen further. She became more careful, more exact, more aware of appearances. It would be too simple to say that one episode shaped her entire life. Human beings are formed by many influences, yet this experience clearly hardened certain habits that had already begun in childhood. She watched people more closely. She trusted more slowly. She understood that affection could conceal appetite, and that closeness to power always carried danger. Her world remained unsettled in other ways as well. The kingdom under Edward VI was changing religiously and politically. Protestant reforms moved forward. Old certainties vanished. New language entered worship. New conflicts opened. Men argued over doctrine with the same seriousness others gave to war. Because in that age, the health of the soul and the peace of the realm were thought inseparable. Elizabeth grew within this atmosphere too, learning not only to read and speak, but to navigate questions that could divide families and kingdoms. She became skilled at expressing herself in ways that were thoughtful yet guarded. This was not emptiness, it was prudence. She knew how to sound respectful without surrendering independence. She knew how to answer without exposing all she thought. Such habits may seem cold to those who live in safer times, but for Elizabeth, they were forms of emotional shelter. Even in quieter days, the memory of danger lingered. A creak on the stair in the early morning, voices carried behind a door, a sudden message requesting her presence, the formal tone of an official letter. These things could unsettle a person who had known instability since infancy. Yet Elizabeth appears to have transformed unease into vigilance. She did not let fear make her foolish. She let it make her alert. This alertness extended to reading character. Some people reveal themselves through grand gestures. Others reveal themselves in the moment between hearing a question and answering it. Elizabeth became attentive to such moments. She learned to notice vanity disguised as kindness, ambition disguised as loyalty, and piety used as display. This did not make her incapable of affection, but it made affection, for her, inseparable from judgment. There would still have been peaceful scenes in her life. Afternoons of reading, needlework set aside near a window, music in another chamber, riding in the clear air of the countryside, conversation with trusted tutors, the rustle of pages, the smell of wax and parchment, the relief of familiar routine. Yet even these calm moments acquired depth because they existed beside danger. Quiet was precious to one who knew how easily it could be disturbed. Her own speech, too, grew elegant and controlled. She could be lively in learned company. She could translate difficult passages with ease. She could answer graciously when praised. But beneath this refinement lay a discipline almost severe. She knew that words leave traces, words are repeated, words are altered in retelling. Once spoken, they belong partly to others. Better, then, to choose them carefully. As she moved through adolescence, Elizabeth became a figure both admired and carefully watched. She was attractive, educated, royal, unmarried, and politically significant. Those qualities made her valuable. They also made her vulnerable. Every possible marriage held implications. Every friendship might be interpreted. every visit, every letter, every public appearance could feed speculation. She had grown up in the shadow of queens who suffered when expectation, desire, and judgment converged. She would not forget that. So restraint became not merely a habit, but a style of being. She did not rush. She did not confide too easily. She did not let herself be cornered by haste. If childhood had taught her loneliness, and youth had taught her danger, she answered both with composure. That composure would later seem majestic. At this stage, it was still partly defensive, like a candle flame cupped against the wind. In the chambers where she lived, one can imagine the small signs of this inward strengthening. Letters folded and answered with care. Books marked by regular use. A young woman pausing before she speaks, not from uncertainty, but from choice. The slight delay before a reply. The calm face that reveals little. The courtesy that remains even when trust is withheld. These are not dramatic things, yet history often turns on such quiet disciplines. Elizabeth's life in these years was not the life of someone free to become herself in the ordinary way. She became herself by guarding herself. She shaped her character under observation. She grew wise because innocence had never been allowed to remain simple. Stepmothers came and went. Men rose and fell. Faith and policy shifted. The court watched. The kingdom listened. And in the midst of all this, she learned a form of strength that did not announce itself loudly. It was the strength of holding still, the strength of listening longer than others expected, the strength of knowing that silence can be fuller than speech, the strength of surviving not by force, but by measure. These years laid deep foundations. The lonely child of Anne Boleyn was now a learned and self-possessed young woman. She had passed through the dangerous nearness of a reckless man. She had answered inquiry without losing herself. She had seen enough of courtly love and courtly ruin to distrust both appearances and impulses. And she had discovered that in a world of shifting loyalties, the most reliable refuge might be the well-governed mind. So she continued, moving with care through rooms where others sought advantage, carrying within her a private discipline that grew stronger in silence. The girl who had once listened to whispers in cold corridors now understood them. She knew why voices dropped. She knew how much could hide behind a smile. She knew how fragile safety could be. And because she knew these things, she began, quietly and almost without anyone noticing, to master them. But mastery did not bring safety. Not yet. When Edward VI fell ill, the kingdom began to tremble again. He was still very young, yet around his bed gathered all the anxieties of England. He was the long-desired son, the Protestant king, the fragile centre of a religious settlement that many wished to preserve and many others wished to reverse. His body had become a political fact. Each sign of weakness carried consequences far beyond the chamber where he lay. Elizabeth, by then a young woman, could only watch as others made plans around the future. She knew enough to understand what his decline might mean. If Edward died, the succession would move again into uncertain country. Mary, her older half-sister, stood next in line according to Henry's final arrangements. Mary was devoted to the old faith. She had suffered much under their father. She had endured humiliation, exclusion, and years of inner strain. If she came to the throne, England would not simply have a new ruler. It would have a ruler shaped by memory, injury, and conviction. In the summer of 1553, Edward died. He was 15 years old. For a brief moment there was confusion, an effort to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, but the kingdom, in the end, turned to Mary. She entered London as Queen amid powerful feeling. Crowds gathered, bells rang. There was relief in many hearts that the succession had not dissolved into civil war. There was also uncertainty, because Mary's reign promised return and reversal. The old religion would rise again. The world that had formed Elizabeth's education and household life might shift beneath her feet. For Elizabeth, Mary's accession was both a blessing and a danger. She was no longer the sister of a ruling boy king, whose court had room for her learning and careful grace. She was now the half-sister of a queen who had reason to mistrust the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Blood linked them. History divided them. They had both suffered under Henry, but not in the same way. Mary had seen her mother, Catherine of Aragon, set aside and dishonoured. She had seen Anne Boleyn rise where her own mother had fallen. However innocent Elizabeth had been as a child, she still carried Anne's face in the memory of the court. At first, there was a fragile courtesy between the sisters. Mary could be generous in formal ways. She recognized Elizabeth's rank. She allowed her a place near the throne. Publicly, there was every reason to display family order. The kingdom needed calm, but beneath the surface lay religious tension and personal suspicion. Mary was a devout Catholic. Elizabeth had been shaped by Protestant education and Protestant company. Mary wanted England restored to Rome. Elizabeth understood that many in the realm looked to her as a possible Protestant alternative, whether she welcomed that role or not. This was the beginning of a new kind of captivity, not always behind bars, not always spoken aloud, but real all the same. Under Mary, Elizabeth lived in a state of watchfulness within watchfulness. Every word mattered more than before. Every movement could be interpreted. If she attended Mass, some would say she was sincere. Others would say she only obeyed from necessity. If she hesitated, that hesitation itself became a sign. Around her gathered servants, officials, and attendants, not all of whom could be trusted, and some of whom reported more than they comforted. The Queen's counsellors watched her carefully. Ambassadors wrote about her to foreign courts. Noblemen measured her conduct. Those dissatisfied with Mary's religious changes looked toward Elizabeth with hope, even if she had given them none. In such a condition, a person becomes a mirror for other people's desires and fears. Elizabeth knew this. She knew that she could become a symbol against her will. She knew, too, that symbols are often sacrificed. Mary's reign soon grew heavier. Her marriage plans stirred unrest. Her restoration of Catholic worship sharpened the divisions already present in the realm. Sermons changed. Services changed. Bishops changed. The old language returned to the churches. Men who welcomed the changes spoke with relief. Men who resisted them grew quieter or more dangerous. Neighbours studied neighbours. Conscience became visible in public acts. Religion was not private in Tudor England. It ordered the nation, and it exposed the heart. Elizabeth had to move through this atmosphere like someone crossing thin ice. She could not openly oppose her sister. That would be ruin. She could not fully embrace the old religion without betraying the education and alliances that had shaped her. That too had consequences. So she did what she had learned to do since childhood. She gave little away. She obeyed where she must. She delayed where she could. She spoke in measured tones. She watched. Yet caution could not protect her from everything. In early 1554, rebellion broke out. It is known now as Wyatt's Rebellion, named after Sir Thomas Wyatt, one of its leaders. The revolt was driven in part by opposition to Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain, and in part by broader fear of foreign influence and Catholic restoration. Elizabeth was not its architect, but her name hovered near it like mist over water. Rebels spoke of her. Others imagined her as the figure who might replace Mary. In times of unrest, a princess need not act to become dangerous. It is enough that others act in her name. For Mary, already burdened by distrust and fear, this was deeply alarming. For Elizabeth, it was the nightmare she had long understood could come. To be associated with rebellion was perilous, whether or not the association was fair. Her past had taught her that innocence does not always save. Her mother had fallen amid accusation. She herself had survived inquiry once before. Now the stakes were greater, because the Queen on the throne had reason, religion, and memory all aligned against her. Elizabeth was summoned to court. She was ill at the time, or said to be. Illness in such moments carries its own sadness. The body weakens just when strength is most required. She delayed leaving, perhaps from genuine sickness, perhaps from caution, perhaps from both. But delay itself could appear suspicious. The roads were muddy with winter and early spring damp. The skies low. Messages passed back and forth. Orders hardened. At last, she was brought toward London under guard. There is a stillness that belongs to journeys made without freedom. Horses move, wheels turn, villages pass. But the traveller does not really travel toward a destination. She travels toward judgment. Elizabeth must have known this. She had lived with the memory of the tower all her life. It was where her mother had gone and never returned. It was where kings had confined rivals, and where queens had awaited death. To go there as Anne Boleyn's daughter was to enter a circle of memory too painful to miss. On the 18th day of March, 1554, Elizabeth was taken by water to the Tower of London. The river journey itself must have seemed unreal. The Thames, grey and broad under the cold light, carried her past familiar banks and toward the old fortress. Oars dipped. Water folded away from the boat in slow patterns. The city rose along the shore, its roofs and towers muted under the season's pale sky. People would have watched, some in silence, some with pity, some perhaps with calculation. A royal prisoner passing by river was a sight heavy with meaning. As the tower came nearer, its walls must have seemed at once solid and dreamlike. Stone above water, battlements against the sky, windows narrow and dark. It was not merely a building. It was a place thick with England's memory of punishment and fear. Those who entered it did not know when they would leave, or in what condition. Elizabeth is said to have resisted entering by Traitor's Gate. Whether every detail later reported is exact, the deeper truth remains. She knew what the tower meant. She knew what had happened there to her mother. She knew what it might mean for herself. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, now 20 years old, crossed into the same fortress where Anne had prayed, waited, and died. Inside the tower was not dramatic in the way stories later imagine it. It was colder than that, more ordinary in its sadness. Stone walls held the damp. Corridors turned and narrowed. Doors shut with practical finality. Locks clicked. Windows admitted light in thin portions. A person enclosed there does not live in constant noise. She lives in intervals. A step in the passage, the rattle of a key, a voice outside, then silence again. Elizabeth was lodged in the royal apartments within the tower, not in the darkest kind of prison cell. Yet comfort means little when liberty is gone. Fine rooms can still become places of fear. A carpet does not soften uncertainty. A chair, a table, a curtained bed, even a fire in the grate, cannot alter the essential truth that one's fate lies in other hands. The days there must have stretched strangely. Morning would come first as a dim change in the window, then as a pale shape of light on the floor. The stone would hold the night's chill. Servants, limited and watched, would move quietly. Food would arrive. Messages might come or not come. Every absence of news could wound. Every rumor could disturb the breath. Waiting is one of the hardest forms of suffering, because it offers no object to resist. One cannot fight uncertainty. One can only endure it. And Elizabeth knew too much history to wait innocently. She knew the stories of those who had entered the tower before her. She knew what accusation could become once formal inquiry began. She knew that confessions could be extracted, that evidence could be bent, that politics could wear the dress of justice. Above all, she knew the shadow of her mother's end. It would have been impossible not to think of Anne there. Perhaps in the quietest hours, Elizabeth imagined the young queen moving through similar rooms, guarded and alone, listening for footsteps that might carry news of life or death. The physical details of confinement gain strange power when the mind has little else to hold. A narrow window becomes a calendar of light. Morning enters at one angle, afternoon at another. Dust turns golden for an hour and then disappears. Rain marks the glass or darkens the stone outside. A bird passes once and is gone. The world continues beyond the walls, indifferent and unreachable. Then there are the sounds. Footsteps in the corridor, sometimes quick, sometimes slow. A pause outside the door. The scratch of metal as a key turns. A murmur between guards. The shutting of a lock. Somewhere farther away, a bell. A cart rolling over uneven ground. The faint cry of gulls by the river. Such sounds become the structure of a prisoner's day. They wake hope and extinguish it in the same moment. Is the step approaching for me? Is the key meant for my door? Has news come? Has judgment come? Each sound asks a question and answers none. Elizabeth's strength in those weeks seems to have lain in inward order. She prayed. Prayer had accompanied her through every phase of life, though the form and language of it had shifted with England's changing faith. In the Tower, prayer would have been more than duty. It would have been rhythm, steadiness, and refuge. To pray is to place the uncertain day into a frame larger than fear. It does not remove danger, but it keeps the soul from scattering. Perhaps she knelt by the bed in the dim early morning, when the room was still blue with first light. Perhaps she sat later by the window with folded hands, lips moving silently. Perhaps she prayed not only for deliverance, but for wisdom, for the strength not to speak rashly, for the strength to bear what she could not alter, for the grace to live if she were spared, and the courage to die if she were not. These are old prayers. The tower had heard them before. She also thought. Thinking was one of her oldest habits. Not restless thinking alone, but ordered thinking. She may have gone over every recent event in memory, testing where danger lay. She may have considered who among the council feared her most, who might defend her, who had already judged her guilty in private. She may have weighed every word she had spoken in past months. In confinement, memory can become both enemy and instrument. It torments. It also prepares. And surely, in some quieter layer of thought, she remembered her parents. Her father, Henry, vast and changeable, who had acknowledged her, diminished her, restored her, and shaped every early uncertainty by the force of his desires. Her mother, Anne, more absent than present in her lived memory, yet never absent from the story others told about her. Anne the Queen, Anne the condemned, Anne whose blood and face remained in Elizabeth's identity, whether she wished it or not. To sit in the tower as Anne's daughter was to feel time fold inward. The child once carried through cold corridors had become a woman enclosed by stone, still under suspicion, still surviving by restraint. The pattern was painful, but perhaps it also hardened her resolve. She had inherited not safety, but the need to endure. Questioning continued around her. Councillors wanted proof of complicity in rebellion. They wanted clarity or confession, or at least enough ambiguity to justify harsher treatment. Elizabeth answered as she always had when danger closed in, carefully, respectfully, without surrendering more than truth required. She denied involvement. She asked for fairness. She held to her innocence with composure rather than theatrical display. This matters. A different temperament might have broken into anger or wild protest. Elizabeth understood the peril of both. She had learned long ago that even justified emotion can be turned against the speaker. So she remained measured. Inwardly, she may have been afraid almost beyond bearing. Outwardly, she was controlled. The tower teaches slowness. Days do not race there. They collect. Morning becomes noon. Noon becomes evening. Candlelight replaces grey light. Shadows lengthen across the floorboards or stones. A draught enters under the door. A servant removes a tray. Footsteps recede. Then the long region of night begins, where thought grows louder because the world has gone quiet. Night in confinement has its own texture. The room cools. The fire sinks low. The sounds outside become fewer, then strangely clearer. A guard coughs in the passage. Rain touches the window. A chain shifts somewhere in the dark. Sleep comes lightly, if at all, and dreams carry memory into uneasy shapes. Perhaps Elizabeth woke more than once and lay still, listening, aware of how thin the line can be between waiting and sentence. The changing light on the floor may have become one of her few companions. Morning silver, afternoon gold, evening dimness moving slowly upward along the wall. The patient movement of light reminds a confined person that time still exists outside fear. This can be cruel, but also consoling. The world has not ended. The sun still reaches the room, though only in fragments. Life continues beyond stone. She also wrote, or wished to write. Elizabeth had always used words to shape thought. In danger, writing becomes another form of prayer. A letter to the Queen, a statement of innocence, an appeal framed with humility and firmness. She knew how to choose language that did not inflame. She knew how to sound dutiful without self-abandonment. Even under suspicion, she could still govern a page. Yet all such efforts moved through channels she did not control. That was the heart of captivity. To think clearly and still not command the outcome. To know one's innocence and still depend on other people's belief. To pray and wait while others debate one's life in distant rooms. Mary, for her part, remained uncertain. She was queen, but not free from fear. Rebellion had nearly touched her throne. Her marriage plans were contested. Her faith told her one story about duty. Her memory told her another story about Anne Boleyn and Anne's child. It is possible that she did not wholly wish Elizabeth dead. It is equally clear that she could not wholly trust her. Between those two truths lay danger enough. Weeks in the Tower eventually gave way to another kind of confinement. Elizabeth was removed to Woodstock, where she remained under strict watch, but the Tower stayed with her. Places of fear do not vanish when one leaves them. They continue inwardly. The sound of keys, the narrowness of windows, the waiting for news, the knowledge that one's enemies may be interpreting silence as guilt and speech as cunning. These things leave marks deeper than bruises. During her imprisonment and afterward, Elizabeth had to practice patience at the highest level. She could not force her sister's affection. She could not command trust. She could only persist in caution. She obeyed where obedience was wise. She kept her religious expressions measured. She accepted surveillance because refusal would be read as defiance. She survived by neither provoking nor collapsing. It is tempting to call this merely prudence, but it was more than that. It was emotional discipline under prolonged uncertainty. Many people can appear calm for an hour. Far fewer can remain composed through months of suspicion. Elizabeth managed it because she had been preparing, in one sense, since birth. The early loneliness, the careful education, the Seymour crisis, the long habit of watching before speaking, all of it had formed her for exactly this kind of endurance. And so, in the Tower, amid the stone walls and locked doors, something within her seems to have grown even steadier. Not softer, not safer, steadier. She learned that fear could be carried without being shown. She learned that waiting could be survived one day at a time. She learned that memory, even painful memory, could serve as a stern companion. Her mother had faced these walls. Her father's choices had built the world that enclosed her. Yet she herself was still alive, still thinking, still praying, still preparing. That word matters. Preparing. not preparing in any loud or ambitious sense, not plotting, not reaching, not dreaming openly of crowns, rather preparing in the inward way of a person who refuses to be undone, preparing her language, preparing her mind, preparing her spirit to endure whatever came next. If release came, she must be ready to live carefully. If accusation hardened, she must be ready to answer. If death approached, she must be ready to meet it with dignity. There is a calm that can grow only in the neighborhood of danger. It is not innocence. It is not ignorance. It is the calm of someone who has looked steadily at uncertainty and has chosen not to let it govern the soul. Elizabeth, in those narrow rooms, seems to have come close to such calm. Picture the chamber near evening, light fading from the window, the floor touched by one last pale strip of gold, the air colder now. Somewhere outside, the river moving past the tower walls as it always had, indifferent to queens and prisoners alike. Inside, a young woman sits very still. She hears steps in the passage. She does not rise too quickly. She has learned that haste changes nothing. She folds her hands. She waits. The key turns. The door opens. Perhaps it brings only a servant with supper. Perhaps a message. Perhaps nothing that will change her fate today. Still, she waits. And in that waiting, there is already the shape of the ruler she will one day become. For now, though, she is simply Elizabeth under guard, half-sister to a queen, daughter of Henry and Anne, enclosed in stone and shadow, measuring time by light and footsteps, surviving by prayer, memory and restraint. And time, which had so often threatened Elizabeth, continued to move in its patient way. Mary's reign did not grow easier as it went on. The kingdom remained troubled. Her marriage to Philip of Spain brought little comfort to her people. The hope of an heir faded. False pregnancies deepened private sorrow and public uncertainty. The burnings of Protestant heretics cast a long and painful shadow across England. Men and women died for faith under a grey sky, and the smoke of those deaths drifted far beyond the places where the fires were lit. Mary believed she was serving truth. Many feared her all the same. Elizabeth lived carefully through these years. She remained outwardly dutiful. She attended when required. She wrote respectful letters. She did not offer the realm any open sign around which opposition might gather. Yet the eyes of many were already turning toward her. This happened slowly, almost like winter light changing on a wall. At first, it was only a thought in private rooms. Then it became a subject in letters. Then a hope in cautious hearts. The Queen had no child. That fact sat in every council chamber, even when no one spoke it aloud. It shaped alliances, prayers, anxieties, and foreign calculations. Mary was still alive, still ruling, still determined. But beyond her stood Elizabeth, the next in line by the settlement that had survived so many storms. To some, this was consoling. To others, alarming. To Elizabeth herself, it must have felt like standing beneath a sky that grows heavier the more one sees how wide it is. Mary's health began to fail in the final year of her life. It did not happen all at once. Decline rarely does. There are first the smaller signs: weariness that does not lift, a body less willing to recover, her face altered by pain and disappointment. Then there are the longer absences from strength, the court notices, servants' notice, ambassadors' notice. The air in the palace changes before any official statement is made. Voices soften. Movements become more careful. People listen for news in the tone of footsteps. Mary was only in her early 40s, yet grief and strain had aged her. She had carried the burden of legitimacy, religion, marriage, expectation, and memory. She had entered the throne with fierce purpose. She had wanted to restore what she believed had been broken. She had wanted to bring England back into the old faith and to secure the future with a child of her own body. These hopes had not come to rest as she wished. In the end, there was no living air beside her bed. There was no settled peace around her reign. There was only the narrowing path toward death. To speak of Mary gently is fitting. She had known sorrow from childhood. She had been wounded long before she became queen. Her hardness did not come from emptiness, but from memory and conviction. Those who suffered under her rule remembered the flame. Those who looked more closely might also remember the lonely child she once had been, displaced from her mother, forced to bend before her father's will. Tudor daughters were not granted easy lives, even when born to crowns. As Mary weakened, the question of succession moved from private unease toward unavoidable fact. Philip was away. Councillors had to think beyond her. The realm had to think beyond her. And with each passing week, the figure who stood ahead in the minds of many was Elizabeth. The same Elizabeth once watched, once imprisoned, once mistrusted. Now the kingdom began to imagine itself in relation to her. There is a strange sorrow in being awaited while another person still breathes. Elizabeth, whatever her private feelings, could not openly desire the crown. That would have been monstrous and dangerous, yet she could not prevent others from looking toward her with hope. She lived in that difficult middle place where sympathy for a dying sister had to coexist with awareness that a great burden was drawing nearer. One can imagine the late autumn of 1558 as a season of suspended breath. The leaves nearly gone, the fields bare, air colder with each week, fires lit earlier in the day, the roads damp, the sky often low and white. In chambers across England, men spoke quietly of what might come. In London, at court, the rhythm of service continued, but with a hush beneath it. Everyone understood that a reign might be ending. Mary died on the 17th day of November, 1558. The passing itself, as with so many final moments, was quieter than the years that led to it. A life so filled with policy, ceremony, argument, pain, and conscience came at last to stillness. Around the bed there would have been prayers, attendance, solemn faces. The old forms observed one final time. A queen was dying. A sister was dying. A chapter of England was closing, not with a trumpet, but with a breath that did not return. Elizabeth was at Hatfield when the news reached her. The scene has often been remembered, and it lingers because it carries both grandeur and simplicity. She was in the countryside, away from the crowded anxiety of London. It was November. Trees stood stripped and dark against the pale sky. The ground was cold. The day held that thin English light, which seems to arrive reluctantly and depart too soon. A messenger came. Formal words were spoken. The fact of Mary's death was joined at once to another fact. Elizabeth was now queen. In that moment, the life she had lived until then fell behind her, though not away from her. Everything changed, and yet nothing within her could change quickly enough to match the news. She had been watched, doubted, educated, threatened, and preserved. She had known cold rooms, long silences, locked doors, and careful letters. Now the crown, which had hovered at a distance for so many years, rested suddenly on her name. It is said that she received the news with composed gravity. That seems likely. It was her way. She did not rush into display. She did not lose herself in outward excitement. Instead, she understood the solemnity of the moment. Her sister was dead. The kingdom had shifted. She herself stood at the edge of a task larger than any private feeling. Words were spoken then that later generations would treasure, words linking the event to God's will. Whether every phrase has come down exactly as first uttered matters less than the feeling behind them. Elizabeth had lived long enough with danger to see survival itself as providence. She had not seized the crown. She had been carried to it through years that might easily have destroyed her. If she spoke with reverence, it was not only public duty, it was also memory. From Hatfield, she began to move toward London. That journey must have felt unlike any other she had ever made. The roads were still the roads of England, wet in places, edged by late autumn fields, villages quiet under smoke from chimneys. But now, each stage of the route brought new greetings. The further she travelled, the more she entered the nation's expectation. Noblemen, gentlemen, clergy, and common people looked toward her carriage or horseback progress with curiosity, relief, hope, and calculation. Some saw in her the promise of religious change. Some saw the restoration of the line in a form they could accept. Some perhaps simply wanted peace after years of strain. The mood around her was not wild in every place. It was deeper and more mixed than that. There is a calm kind of joy that comes when a feared uncertainty begins to lift. Perhaps that was present. A loosening of breath, a sense that the kingdom had turned a page without tearing itself apart. Elizabeth, with her intelligence and restraint already known, seemed to many like a figure capable of balance after extremity. As she approached London, the city prepared. Winter was not yet fully closed in, but the air had sharpened. Mornings carried frost in some places. Breath could be seen in the cold. The river moved under a pale sky, and smoke rose from countless hearths. London was still a city of timbered houses, church towers, narrow streets, market cries, and crowded life. On ceremonial days, it could dress itself in colour. Banners were hung. Fabrics were displayed from windows. Pageants were planned. The city understood how to greet a monarch with both loyalty and spectacle. Yet in the quiet distance of memory, all this can seem softened. Bells ringing through the cold air, but not harshly. Crowds gathered in heavy winter clothes, but seen almost as if through mist. Faces lifted, hands raised, the red, gold, and blue of banners moving gently in the wind. Horses stepping carefully over the streets. Trumpets sounding far off, their brightness blurred by space and season. It is the kind of scene one remembers later in the dark, not in sharp lines, but in glowing fragments. Elizabeth entered London in state before her coronation, and the city welcomed her warmly. She had a gift already for receiving affection without appearing overwhelmed by it. She looked, she listened, she answered with graciousness. The people's voices rose around her. Their joy had many causes. Some rejoiced for religion, some for stability, some simply because they sensed in her a ruler who might belong to England in a particular way, neither foreign in marriage nor rigid in manner. As she passed through the streets, pageants presented symbolic messages, children spoke speeches, civic leaders offered gifts and words of loyalty. Meaning was layered into every decorated arch and embroidered cloth. A queen in Tudor England did not merely arrive. She was interpreted, offered images of herself by those who wished to shape the beginning of her reign. Elizabeth, keen reader of signs that she was, would have understood this deeply. The city was not only welcoming her, it was speaking to her. Still, beyond the public brightness, there must have been private awareness moving steadily within her. Every cheer also reminded her of expectation. Every smiling face implied need. Every bell that sounded for joy also sounded for duty. She had spent years learning to survive by caution. Now she would have to rule by judgment. There is no full preparation for such a change. One can only carry old disciplines into new responsibilities. Her coronation came on the 15th day of January, 1559. The season was cold. Winter had settled firmly by then. The air around Westminster would have held that clear sharpness which makes stone seem colder and voices more distinct. The Abbey, ancient and solemn, stood ready with its long memory of kings and queens. Candles burned against the dimness. Choir voices rose and floated beneath vaulted space. Great nobles moved in their appointed order. Clergy, officers, guards, heralds, and attendants all filled the ritual with structure. The ceremony was old, larger than any one life, and Elizabeth stepped into it as both participant and offering. She wore robes heavy with fur, velvet, and embroidery. Such garments were made to express majesty, but they also had real physical weight. The cloth pulled at the shoulders. The layers warmed and constrained the body. Jewels caught the candlelight, but they too weighed upon the neck and sleeves. To be dressed as sovereign is not to feel light. It is to be clothed in symbol until the body itself becomes part of the state. The crown, when it came, was no simple ornament. It rested with visible splendor, but also with pressure. Metal and jewels above the brow. A circle closed around the head. It marked divine ceremony, legal authority, public expectation, and mortal burden all at once. Elizabeth had long imagined the crown as danger from a distance. Now she felt its actual weight. During the rites, she would have heard prayers, oaths, the movement of silk, the low murmur of gathered rank, the measured sound of ceremony unfolding exactly as prescribed. Yet perhaps all of it reached her through a veil of inward concentration. Such moments can become strangely still at the center. The world around is full, but the person at its heart feels the hush of irreversible change. She was anointed. She was invested. She was crowned. She was acclaimed. The people shouted. Bells rang again across London. Cannon may have sounded. Feasting followed. The city, the court, the foreign ambassadors, all would mark the moment according to their own hopes and judgments. But in the deeper sense, something quieter had happened. The solitary child of dangerous corridors had become Queen of England. That transformation was magnificent from the outside. From the inside, it must have been solemn almost beyond words. What does a person feel in such an hour? Relief, perhaps, at having survived long enough to reach it. Fear, certainly, at the vastness now resting on her. Determination, because hesitation would invite chaos. And loneliness, because there are very few souls with whom a newly crowned ruler can speak plainly. Ceremony surrounds the monarch. It does not remove solitude. After the processions, the greetings, the formalities, there would at last have been a quieter room. Not silence complete, for courts are never wholly silent. Somewhere a servant moves. Somewhere a door opens and closes. Somewhere distant voices continue. Yet compared with the abbey and the streets, the room feels hushed. Firelight shifts on the walls. The heavy robes are loosened or partly removed. The crown is set aside. The head feels strangely light and tired after bearing it. The body, long held in posture, breathes more naturally at last. Elizabeth alone, or nearly alone, in such a room, is one of the most moving images of her life. She would have breathed slowly, that seems certain, not as performance, simply because the body seeks calm after the strain of public ritual. The hands, perhaps still marked by rings, and the memory of pressure, rest for a while. The shoulders release. The face that had remained composed before thousands softens in private, though not into weakness, only into thought. What did she think of then? Perhaps first of the day itself, passing through her mind in fragments, the cold air, the bells, the sea of faces, the smell of wax and incense in the abbey, the weight of velvet, the hard brightness of jewels, the moment when the crown touched her head. Then perhaps, more deeply, of those no longer present. Mary, dead only weeks before, stern and wounded sister. Edward, long gone, bright boy king of another. Settlement. Henry, father whose will had rearranged all their lives. Anne, mother whose shadow had never left her. To become queen is also to inherit the dead. Their choices, sufferings, failures, and absences gather around the new reign, whether invited or not. She may have thought too of the future in broad strokes rather than in specific plans. The kingdom was divided in religion. Finances were strained. Foreign powers watched closely. Marriage questions would soon press upon her. Counselors would advise, urge, and contend. Every decision could alter peace or danger. She knew enough already to understand that rule was not a pageant. It was labor joined to uncertainty. And yet hope must have been present too. Not a bright, childish hope, not the hope that imagines ease, rather the steadier hope of someone who has survived enough to believe endurance can be shaped into purpose. Elizabeth had not reached the throne by accident alone. She had prepared herself through years of learning, silence, and disciplined thought. Now those inward stores could be used not merely for survival, but for governance. Even so, hope did not cancel fear. The crown often appears in portraits as certainty. In reality, it sharpens doubt. A private person can hesitate. A monarch's hesitation can alter nations. every request, every petition, every marriage proposal, every religious settlement, every pardon, every punishment. All now came toward her. The realm that had once watched her from a distance would now look directly at her for answer. This knowledge must have lain over the quiet room like another robe, invisible but heavy. Outside, winter London continued to celebrate. Bells still moved through the air above roofs and river. Torches glowed. Voices carried in the streets. Banners stirred in the cold. The city dreamed itself into a new reign. But inside, where the Queen sat alone for a moment at last, the feeling was more delicate. Not triumph only, not joy only. Something more human and more solemn. Hope, because the future was open. Fear, because openness is another name for uncertainty. Determination, because she had no choice now but to meet the work before her. And loneliness, because power gathers people, while separating the powerful from ordinary ease. This mixture would remain with her for years. Perhaps it began fully there, in that first quiet after-ceremony. She had crossed from being the object of policy to the maker of it. The watching girl, the careful prisoner, the learned princess, the suspected sister, had become the woman on whom the realm would depend. The fire burned low and then was stirred. A servant may have entered and withdrawn. The light in the room shifted a little. Elizabeth breathed again slowly and looked ahead into the long labour of reign, not yet into legend, not yet into victory, only into work, burden, danger, and possibility. The night outside held London in celebration. The room held her in thought, and between those two worlds, public splendour and private solitude, the first true shape of her queenship began. And so the reign began to lengthen. At first, everything seemed to ask the same question in different forms. Would she marry? Whom would she choose? How would religion be settled? Could this young queen hold together a kingdom still tender from years of change? Every ambassador, every counsellor, every noble household seemed to listen for her answer. Yet Elizabeth had learned long ago that not answering too quickly is itself a kind of answer. She moved carefully in the early years, as one might move through a room where the floorboards are old and every step must be tested. Her council was filled with experienced men. William Cecil, grave, thoughtful, and tireless, soon became the most constant among them. He had served under Edward VI. He understood government not as display, but as endless labour. Papers, drafts, reports, accounts, names, laws, alliances, risks. He was not dazzling, but he was steady. And steady people are precious to rulers. Around him stood others, each with their own character and influence. Nicholas Bacon, solid and deliberate. Francis Walsingham, sharp and vigilant in later years, always listening for danger beneath ordinary talk. Robert Dudley, bright, intimate, admired, and sometimes troubling in the depth of feeling he stirred in the Queen and in the court. There were bishops, treasurers, secretaries, nobles, military men, and ambassadors from foreign lands. Some served faithfully, some served themselves. Most served both causes at once, as human beings often do. Elizabeth listened. This was one of her greatest habits, and it had been formed in childhood. Men brought advice in careful speeches, They urged urgency where she preferred delay. They recommended marriages, treaties, punishments, or concessions. Some were wise, some were frightened, some disguised ambition as patriotism. Elizabeth let them speak. She asked questions. She weighed the room, not only the words. She watched how one man responded when another spoke. She read silence as closely as argument. Then, often later than others wished, she decided. This could frustrate her servants. Cecil especially knew the burden of waiting upon a queen who preferred to hold several possibilities in her mind at once. Yet delay was not simply indecision. It was method. Elizabeth understood that once a monarch declares a path, many roads close behind her. Better, then, to let others reveal themselves first. Better to preserve room for maneuver while still possible. This was sometimes wearying to those around her. It was often useful to the kingdom. The question of religion came early and heavily. England had swung from Henry's break with Rome to Edward's Protestant reforms, then back again under Mary's Catholic restoration. Elizabeth could not avoid the matter. It reached into every parish, every chapel, every conscience, every foreign alliance. Yet she approached it with a caution shaped by memory. She had seen religion used to divide, to punish, and to consume. She knew the realm needed a settlement broad enough to hold. The settlement that emerged in 1559 restored the royal supremacy over the English Church and established a form of Protestant worship, but with a certain carefulness in language and practice. It did not satisfy everyone. Few settlements ever do. Zealous Catholics found it a wound. More fervent Protestants found it too cautious. Yet in its measured way, it reflected Elizabeth herself. She preferred order to purity, obedience to extremity, and outward conformity to open rupture. She did not wish to peer too deeply into every soul if peace could be maintained by a disciplined public form. Even this moderation, however, lived under pressure. Across Europe, religion was not calming. It was sharpening. France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Scotland, the Low Countries, everywhere the old unity of Western Christendom had broken into anxious and often hostile pieces. A Queen of England could not settle religion at home and then sleep peacefully. Foreign rulers would judge her through faith as much as diplomacy. The Pope would judge her. Exiles would judge her. Plots would gather from these judgments. But before the shadows deepened too far, there was the work of shaping an image. Elizabeth understood appearance better than many rulers. She knew that monarchy lives partly in symbol. The crown is metal, but sovereignty is also theatre, memory, and expectation. Over time, she fashioned herself into something more than a woman who happened to reign. She became the Virgin Queen. Later still, she became almost a mother to her people in public language and ritual. These identities were not accidents. They were political creations, though not false in a simple way. They drew upon real choices and turned them into national meaning. Her refusal to marry became central to this image. At the start of her reign, marriage seemed unavoidable to many. Queens regnant were rare and unsettling to the habits of the age. A husband might provide military strength, foreign alliance, and the possibility of an heir. The council urged it, Parliament urged it, foreign princes and their envoys pursued it. Suitors were discussed from England, Spain, Austria, France, and beyond. Portraits were exchanged. Negotiations opened and faded. Names rose, receded, rose again. The court lived for years in the long weather of possibility. Robert Dudley stood nearest to her affections, or seemed to. Their closeness was obvious enough to stir endless talk. He was handsome, lively, and familiar with her in a way few men dared to be. He had known her from youth. He understood something of her wit and her solitude. But closeness did not make marriage simple. His wife, Amy Robsart, died in circumstances that fed ugly suspicion. Even after that, the political cost of marrying Dudley would have been immense. Foreign powers would insult the match. English nobles would envy and resent it. The Queen's judgment would seem ruled by private feeling. Elizabeth may have loved him in her fashion. She did not marry him. In truth, she married no one. This refusal was at first a problem to be solved, then a mystery to be interpreted, and finally a principle woven into her rule. She kept marriage negotiations alive when useful. She let hope bloom in foreign courts and then cool. She flirted with possibilities, delayed, reconsidered, and withheld. To some, this was frustrating. To others, masterful. As long as she remained unmarried, she preserved her own authority from a husband's claim. She also kept diplomatic options open. A possible marriage could be a tool long after any intention to complete it had faded. Yet there was a cost. To refuse marriage in a world that expected it meant enduring constant pressure. Men spoke to her as if her body were a question of state to be resolved. Counsellors worried over succession with good reason. If she died childless, the future might again become unstable. Parliament petitioned. Preachers hinted. Ambassadors pressed. She had to hear all this and remain firm without breaking the bond between ruler and ruled. Slowly, she transformed refusal into symbol. If she had no husband, then she would belong to England itself. If she bore no child, then her people could become her children in public speech. The language of virginity, chastity, and singular devotion grew around her. Courtiers praised her as untouched and therefore wholly sovereign. Poets linked her to moonlight, purity, and antique goddesses. Painters smoothed her features into an almost timeless image. The court helped create this mythology, but Elizabeth encouraged it. She understood its strength. And yet behind the image was a real woman aging under strain. The middle years of her reign were full. They seemed brilliant from the outside. Court entertainments glimmered. Progresses through the countryside displayed royal magnificence. Noble houses prepared pageants and feasts. The Queen's speeches stirred affection. Her wit was famous. Her dresses shone with pearls, embroidery, and careful symbolism. She danced in youth, laughed at times, teased ambassadors, delayed grave matters with glittering conversation, and held her courtiers in the orbit of her presence. But behind this radiance stood labour. Papers multiplied. Questions never ended. Ireland troubled the government constantly. The Low Countries drew England toward war with Spain. France remained both rival and necessary counterpart. Money ran short. Harvest failures came in bad years. Plague returned. Local grievances rose into national concern. Conscience, once disturbed, does not easily become quiet again. The Queen had to balance not only policies, but humours, classes, regions, and hopes. Many evenings ended not in music, but in documents. One can picture her late at night, long after the public rooms have dimmed. Candles burn low beside stacks of papers, reports from ambassadors, drafts of replies, petitions, intelligence summaries, lists of appointments, financial accounts, religious complaints, military concerns. She reads, asks for clarification, writes in the margins, or postpones one matter because another presses harder. Her eyes grow tired. Her fingers smell faintly of wax and parchment. Yet still she reads. This is another side of glory rarely painted. The queen in jewels by day becomes the woman bending over paper by night. The hall filled with courtiers gives way to a quieter chamber where only a secretary remains, waiting with lowered eyes for instruction. Outside, the palace sleeps in parts. A guard passes through a corridor. A fire shifts in the grate. Somewhere a clock marks the late hour. Elizabeth continues. William Cecil remained essential in these years. He became Lord Burghley and served as her principal minister with remarkable endurance. He worried, advised, arranged, and endured her anger when necessary. Their relationship was not one of equal ease. She could scold him, resist him, and ignore him. He could tire of her delays. Yet beneath these frictions there was mutual dependence. He provided continuity, memory, and sober statecraft. She provided judgment, legitimacy, and the final mind through which everything passed. Later, Walsingham's shadowed world grew more important. He was made for an age of plots. His network of informants, intercepted letters, agents abroad, and secret intelligence formed a quieter wall around the Queen than stone ever could. He understood that threats to Elizabeth would not always come in armies. They could come in sealed packets, hidden ciphers, secret chapels, whispered promises, and coded hopes. In such a world, patience and ink could save a kingdom as surely as soldiers. No figure drew more danger and sorrow into Elizabeth's reign than Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart was almost everything Elizabeth was not, and yet their lives reflected one another in painful ways. She was a fellow queen. She had beauty, lineage, tragedy, and claims. Raised partly in France, widowed young, Catholic by conviction, she stood before Europe as an alternative image of rightful rule. To many Catholics, she seemed the true heir to England, especially after the Pope's excommunication of Elizabeth in 1570. To many in England, she was a distant star whose light was beautiful and dangerous. At first, Mary Stuart was a queen in Scotland and a problem at a distance. Then misfortune, intrigue, and rebellion drove her south into England in 1568, where she sought Elizabeth's protection. This was one of those historical moments that seem almost designed by fate to torment. A queen seeking refuge from another queen. A cousin and rival asking shelter from the very woman whose throne she threatened by existing. Elizabeth did not know what to do with her, and perhaps no choice was good. To free Mary would be to release a focus for Catholic resistance. To restore her to full power in Scotland was difficult. To hand her over elsewhere was dangerous. So Mary was kept in honourable captivity, not in a dungeon, but in a chain of houses, castles, and guarded residences. Years passed this way. Mary embroidered, wrote letters, complained, hoped, aged. She remained both a prisoner and a symbol. Between the two queens, there was never the meeting that later generations almost expect. They circled each other through paper, policy, report, and imagination. Elizabeth may have felt real pity for Mary at moments. She also feared her. Mary's mere existence invited conspiracy. Plots gathered around her name like ivy around stone. There was the Northern Rising in 1569, a rebellion with Catholic aims. There was the papal bull that declared Elizabeth deposed in the eyes of Rome and released her subjects from obedience. There were continental intrigues, Spanish interest, missionary priests entering England in secret, and a growing sense among Protestant officials that the Queen lived under constant invisible siege. Mary Stuart, whether active or passive in each particular threat, remained the still centre around which many of these anxieties revolved. Letters moved quietly through the dark. Ciphers were used. Messengers crossed borders and roads under assumed purpose. Men swore loyalty in secret chambers. Plans formed and dissolved. Some were foolish, some were grave. Walsingham and his agents listened. Papers were opened, copied, and resealed. The kingdom seemed calm in sunlight and unsettled after dusk, as if beneath the ordinary order of parish bells and market days there flowed another current of intention. Elizabeth lived among this hidden weather for years. This required a strange kind of patience. She had always disliked bloodshed when it could be avoided. She understood too well what it meant to kill an anointed ruler, even one who threatened her. Mary Stuart was not simply a rival claimant. She was a queen by birth and consecration. To condemn her would touch the sacred idea of monarchy itself. Elizabeth hesitated for a long time, and not only from calculation. There was conscience in that hesitation, and memory too. She had seen her mother destroyed by official process. She did not move lightly toward another woman's death. But the plots did not cease. The sense of pressure increased. The Babington plot in 1586 finally drew the net tight. Letters, evidence, and interpretation converged. Mary's involvement seemed clear enough to Elizabeth's ministers, who urged action. Trial followed, sentence followed. Elizabeth delayed again, then yielded, then seemed almost to recoil from what she had allowed. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in 1587. The event echoed painfully through Europe. It also left Elizabeth troubled. However necessary her counsellors believed it to be, the death of Mary Stuart removed one danger by deepening another. Spain, already hostile, had now one more reason to speak of justice, vengeance, and crusade. The Spanish king, Philip II, had once been Mary Tudor's husband. Now he ruled a vast empire and defended Catholic cause and dynastic interest together. Tension with England had been growing for years. English support for Protestant rebels in the Low Countries angered him. English privateers attacked Spanish treasure routes. Religion sharpened every grievance. The execution of Mary Stuart hardened the climate further. An invasion fleet, long feared, now seemed increasingly likely. Even before the Armada appeared, England had been preparing in its uneven way. Ships were readied. Commanders argued. Money was scarce as usual. Local militias trained imperfectly. Prayers were said in churches. Reports came in from ports. The sea, which had always both protected and exposed England, became once more the stage on which fate might approach. In 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed. From a distance, it can be imagined less as a roar and more as a slow darkening line on the water. Great ships under prayer and command, sails bellied with wind, standards moving above decks, priests, sailors, nobles, soldiers, each carrying his own thoughts into the uncertain crossing. To those waiting in England, the news would have arrived first as rumour, then as report, then as confirmed approach. Eyes turned seaward. Bells may have sounded. Riders carried messages inland. Yet even then, much of war remained waiting. Elizabeth herself moved among these anxieties with public courage. At Tilbury, she would later appear before troops in armour over white clothing, speaking words that generations would remember. But before and behind such moments lay many quieter hours. Councillors conferring, maps opened, tide, wind, provisions and command debated, the Queen assuring others while carrying private fear. To rule in danger is often to lend strength one does not entirely feel. The sea campaign itself, seen softly, becomes almost dreamlike. English ships smaller and more manoeuvrable. The great Spanish formation moving through narrow waters. Smoke and gunfire there were, certainly, but from the distance of night memory one sees more the weather, the restlessness of the channel, the long labour of ships under uncertain skies. Messages passed from vessel to vessel. Men prayed. Wood groaned. Lanterns moved against dark water. Then came the fireships at Calais, the breaking of order, the running battle, and at last the storms that scattered the Spanish fleet around Scotland and Ireland. The famous phrase about God's wind has lingered because people at the time truly felt the weather itself had entered history. Storm and sea completed what English planning and fighting had begun. Great ships were driven north and west into perilous waters. Waves, reefs, hunger, disease, exhaustion. The ocean became judge. England rejoiced. The danger had passed, or seemed to. Thanksgiving services were held. Medals were struck. Sermons praised divine favour. Elizabeth's image shone brighter than ever. She had become not only the unmarried queen and motherly sovereign, but the defender of Protestant England against mighty Catholic Spain. The story was powerful. It entered memory quickly, and yet public glory did not erase private exhaustion. After the cheers, the Queen still returned to papers. Victories create work as surely as defeat. There were rewards to decide, claims to manage, costs to count, diplomacy to shape, future threats to consider. The body that had displayed composure before troops and ambassadors still knew tiredness. The mind that had held together fear and resolve still needed to rest, yet often could not. Here again the contrast deepens. By day portraits would show brightness, pearls, white skin untouched by time, the symbolic radiance of rule. By night, the real woman walked through long galleries where fires had burned low. Her servants followed at a respectful distance. The candles along the walls threw shifting light over paintings, tapestries, and polished floors. Her steps echoed softly. Perhaps she paused at a window and saw only black glass reflecting her own pale face. Perhaps she continued walking because sleep would not come easily. Quiet galleries suit this period of her life. They hold grandeur and emptiness together. In the daytime, they were full of petitioners, courtiers, and ceremony. At night, they belonged to thought. Elizabeth could move through them carrying not merely the concerns of a household, but the accumulated burden of decades. Ministers aged beside her. Some died. Favourites disappointed or were lost. Enemies abroad did not disappear. The realm praised her and depended on her. But dependence does not lighten the heart. It deepens solitude. She had chosen, or had come to embody, the role of mother to her people. This language comforted the nation and flattered the queen. Yet motherhood, in this public form, had no private softness. It meant endless availability to concern. A realm has no bedtime. A kingdom does not stop needing because the ruler is tired. There were always more letters, more disputes, more reports from Ireland, more requests for money, more sermons to consider, more fears that what had been preserved might still be lost. And still she endured. In her middle years, Elizabeth seemed to many almost at the height of her powers. She could charm envoys, rebuke nobles, joke with scholars, and appear in shining dress at the centre of a festival, as if time itself had chosen to spare her. But the strain of such constancy was hidden in the spaces between appearances. The face prepared for public gaze is not the same face seen alone beside a table strewn with papers at midnight. Perhaps she sat then with a hand against her temple, reading one more dispatch from abroad. Perhaps a secretary waited while she considered one difficult paragraph. Perhaps she crossed out a phrase and replaced it more carefully. Outside, rain touched the window. Inside, wax pooled slowly below the candle flame. One servant slept on a bench in the outer room. Another stirred the fire. The queen read on. This is how reign truly lengthens, not only in festivals, speeches, portraits, and victories, but in repetition. Document after document, audience after audience, fear answered by composure, hope answered by caution, love from the people answered by labour they cannot see. Elizabeth's greatness, if one uses that word, did not lie only in her pageantry or her famous moments. It lay also in endurance, in her ability to keep carrying the kingdom when there was no one with whom she could fully lay it down. The image of the Virgin Queen shone ever more brightly in public. The woman beneath it grew older, more careful with her affections, and more worn in private. Yet the image served. It united. It inspired. It gave the nation a figure almost mythic in shape. Gloriana, Astrea, queen without equal, wife to England. Such names floated around her like music in a high hall. But when the music faded, when the courtiers withdrew, when the galleries grew still, she was again Elizabeth, moving alone through shadow and candlelight, bearing on her own mind the endless, invisible weight of rule. And time, which had carried her through danger and triumph alike, began at last to show itself more clearly upon her. The years moved forward, but not with the same brightness as before. The court that had once seemed full of colour and motion grew quieter in tone. Carpets, worn by many footsteps, softened under age. Tapestries, once rich in deep colour, faded gently where light had touched them year after year. The great rooms remained, but their air changed. Laughter came less often. Music still played, but it did not echo in quite the same way. Elizabeth herself was no longer the young queen who had entered London with bright eyes and steady confidence. She was older now. Her body felt the weight of long labour. Her joints ached at times. Her sleep was not always easy. The hours of the night stretched longer than before, and yet she continued, as she always had, to carry the burden of the crown without visible complaint. Those around her changed too. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, who had stood beside her through so many years of decision, grew old and bent. His hair whitened. His strength faded slowly, though his mind remained careful and exact. When he died in 1598, it was not only the loss of a minister, it was the loss of a presence that had been steady from the beginning. A voice she had heard through every stage of her reign fell silent. Others followed. Men who had served her in youth were gone or failing. Nicholas Bacon had long since passed. Walsingham too was gone. His quiet network of watchfulness longer guided by his hand. Robert Dudley, once so close to her, had died years before. His absence lingered in a different way, touched with memory and something softer than politics. Faces that had once filled the court now existed only in portraits and recollection. New men rose to serve her. Robert Cecil, son of Burghley, took on his father's duties with skill, though without the same long intimacy. Others stood ready, eager, capable. But for Elizabeth, the change could not be simple. Each new voice reminded her of older ones that were no longer there. Each new face stood where a familiar face had once stood. The court itself aged with her. The floors creaked in familiar ways. Doors opened with sounds she had known for decades. The rhythm of daily life continued, but more slowly. Servants moved with care. Courtiers spoke in lower tones. There was still ceremony, still order, still splendor when required. But beneath it all lay a sense of time passing, not quickly, but steadily, like a tide that does not retreat. Elizabeth often walked through her palaces in the quieter hours. These walks had been part of her life for many years. Now they took on a deeper quality. The galleries seemed longer, the shadows more settled. The candles cast a softer light. She would move with measured steps, sometimes pausing where once she had stood in youth. A window, a chair, a doorway. Each place held memory. Memory came more easily in these later years. She remembered her father, vast and commanding, his presence filling every room. She remembered her mother, though not in clear images, but in the echo of a story she had never fully been allowed to hold. Anne's face, Anne's fall, Anne's silence in the court that followed her death. That absence had shaped Elizabeth from the beginning. She remembered her sister Mary, not only the queen who had imprisoned her, but the woman shaped by loss and belief. Time softens certain edges of memory. The fear and tension of those years remained, but alongside them came understanding. Mary had been alone in her own way, burdened by expectation, driven by conviction. Elizabeth, now old herself, could see more clearly how narrow the paths had been for both of them. She remembered Mary, Queen of Scots. That long shadow across her reign, that distant presence that had drawn so much danger into her life, the letters, the plots, the decision that could not be undone. Even now, in quiet moments, that memory must have stirred, not always as regret, but as weight, a life taken under her authority, a queen judged by another queen. All these memories moved within her as she grew older. And outside, England changed. The years of her reign had seen a flowering of something new. Plays were written and performed. Poetry found new voices. Music filled halls and private rooms alike. Names that would endure began to be spoken with admiration. William Shakespeare, among others, brought stories to the stage that captured the imagination of London. Crowds gathered to watch, to listen, to feel. Elizabeth herself did not always attend such performances in public, yet she was aware of them. The court heard of these works. Lines were repeated. Songs travelled from stage to chamber. The language of the realm grew richer, more expressive. England, under her long rule, was becoming something more than it had been. This growth carried a quiet pride. She had not written the plays. She had not composed the music. Yet her reign had given the space in which such things could flourish. Stability, even when imperfect, allows art to grow. A country not torn by constant war can turn its attention to beauty. Elizabeth, who had spent so many years preserving balance, could look upon this flowering and know that her labour had helped make it possible. Sometimes she listened. A small group of musicians in a chamber, lutes, viols, voices rising softly, the notes moving through the air with gentle precision. She would sit, perhaps near a fire, the light touching her face, her hands still. Music does not demand decision. It does not ask for judgment. It simply unfolds. In those moments, the Queen could be still in a different way, not as a ruler, but as a listener. At other times, she might watch a performance prepared for court, a play with its shifting scenes and voices, actors speaking lines of love, ambition, folly, and fate, stories that echoed, in distant ways, the life she had lived. Kings and queens upon a stage, facing choices that seemed both grand and strangely familiar. She watched, perhaps with a faint smile, perhaps with thoughtfulness. Art reflects life, but it also softens it. And yet, even in these moments, solitude remained. Elizabeth had never married. She had never borne a child. This had been her choice, shaped by necessity, caution, and the deep understanding of her own position. She had chosen the crown, and with it the realm, as the central bond of her life. The language of being married to England had become part of her identity. But choice does not remove feeling. In the quietest hours, when music faded and conversation ended, the absence of a more private companionship may have been felt. Not always as sorrow, but as a simple fact. There was no one who shared her burden fully. No one to whom she could speak without measure. No child who would carry her memory in a direct and living way. Instead, her legacy lay in the country itself. England was her child in a larger sense. Its peace, its struggles, its growth, its conflicts, its culture. All of these bore her mark. This was a form of motherhood that required constant attention and offered no rest. It gave her purpose. It also left her alone at the center of that purpose. As the years drew toward their close, her strength declined more noticeably. She still appeared in public when needed. She still spoke with dignity. But the effort grew heavier. Her body tired more quickly. Her appetite lessened. Sleep became uncertain. There were days when she withdrew more than before, remaining in private chambers, attended by a smaller circle. The court adapted to this change. Voices softened, movement slowed. The urgency of youth was replaced by a kind of watchful patience. Those who served her had to read not only her words, but her condition. They waited more. They pressed less. The rhythm of governance adjusted, though it did not stop. Elizabeth herself seemed to move more often into memory. She sat by windows, looking out over gardens or courtyards. The seasons still changed beyond the glass. Spring returned, as it always does, even to those who have seen it many times. Summer warmed the air. Autumn brought its quiet fading. Winter settled again. Each cycle reminded her of time's passage, not in sudden shifts, but in gentle repetition. She may have remembered the first spring she knew as queen, the first summer progress, the first autumn when she felt the weight of rule settle firmly. Now these seasons came again, but they carried a different feeling. They were no longer beginnings. They were continuations nearing an end. Her final days came without spectacle. There was no great drama in the manner of her passing, no sudden fall, no violent moment. Instead, there was a quiet diminishing. She rested more. She spoke less. Those around her understood, even before it was said aloud, that the long reign was closing. She spent time in stillness, perhaps seated, perhaps lying quietly, attended by those who had served her faithfully. The room would have been warm, the air calm, curtains drawn against the chill, candles burning with steady light. The familiar sounds of a palace continued beyond the door, but they did not disturb the quiet within. In such moments, the past and present often seem to draw close together. The child in the cold corridor, the young girl learning to speak carefully, the prisoner in the tower listening for keys, the queen in shining robes, greeted by crowds, the ruler at her table reading by candlelight. All these selves exist at once in memory, not in sequence, but together. Elizabeth, in her final days, carried them all. She had lived a long life. She had ruled for decades. She had seen danger and endured it. She had seen triumph and carried it. She had chosen her path and remained upon it. She had shaped her country and been shaped by it in return. There is a quiet dignity in such an ending. Not loud, not dramatic, but complete. As the final hours passed, the light in the room would have softened, evening coming gently, shadows lengthening without urgency, the air still, the sounds beyond the chamber fading into distance. Breath, slow and steady, then slower still. No sudden break. Only a gradual release, like a tide that draws back from the shore without noise. The Queen, who had been at the centre of England for so long, became, at last, still. And in that stillness, the long story of her life settled into rest. The candles burned lower, the room grew dim, and the quiet, which had always been there beneath the sound of crowns and voices, remained. Now the story has come to rest. The long corridors are empty. The candles burn low. The voices, once so urgent, have faded into silence. What remains is not the weight of crowns or the noise of courts, but something softer, a life remembered, a presence that once filled rooms, now part of the stillness that follows. Elizabeth is gone, but the world she shaped continues quietly. The words, the music, the memory of her time linger like the last warmth of a fire. There is nothing more to decide, nothing more to carry. Only rest. And in that rest, the past settles gently into the night, where all stories in time grow quiet